Hello and welcome to Minor Composition Season 2. It's been, I think, about what is it, 5 years that I've been collaborating with Firefly. Is around five years. So for this time, we're joined by Silvia, Maglioni, and Graeme Thomson. Thanks for coming along.
Oh,
Thanks
thank you for
having
having
us.
us.
And the idea is for this is every so often it's good to sort of like take stock and rethink like what are we doing, why are we doing it. And I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation with Sylvia and Graham because you do many things, including stack excellent piles of firewood, make excellent films, and for this conversation you're being interpolated as two of the co-founders of Firefly Frequencies. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation about the kinds of collectivity and practices that go into making radio itself, rather than just being a medium, but also as a medium of collectivity and collective practice. So that's the idea. That sound good?
Yeah, great.
Okay. And before we get to it, we're going to have a word from our sponsors. Okay, ready?
Let your father pick up the check.
I think you sacrificed enough, Dad. Let me get this one with my accursed share card.
You have an accursed share card?
That's right. I have the means to acquire the excess that I deserve.
Yes, I know. I've always depended on my accursed share card. I've purchased useless items available due to the convenience of waste for over 30 years. And now you have your share. I'm so proud.
That's right. It's the accursed share card. Get your slice of American excess. The accursed share card is accepted at all points of consumption, great and small. Comply today.
So that was a word from our amazing sponsors, the Accursed Share Card. Have you ever heard the ad before?
Yeah, I have heard that before. Who is it? It's not Negative Land.
It's the Critical Art Ensemble.
Art Ensemble, yeah.
As one of their first collective projects back in the 1990s or late 1980s, commissioned an actual professional advertising company to make a real sounding ad for a very battalion inspired credit card, which I really like the idea of, and I thought it'd be a great place to just flag up as a half joke, half serious point. One, to mark the passing of Steve Kurtz, and two, Critical Art Ensemble as being a collective project is kind of in a way a literal sponsor in terms of coming out of a whole history of forms of collective practices in artistic practices and radio practices that I think is interesting to think about. Maybe not them sponsoring us literally like a company, but as a sort of progenitor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're one of the kind of sort of nodes, salient nodes in thinking about kind of what an alternative sort of online radio project could be, along with Tetsuo Kogawa's Mini FM or the free radio networks that Guattari was kind of instigated after Radio Alice and Radio Alice itself. I suppose, I mean, this pushes more towards the kind of towards art radio as well to some extent, and a kind of maybe sort of situationist inspired practice.
Yeah. What I like about starting there is realizing that, one of my first things I was going to ask about was about the sort of the beginnings of Firefly Frequencies, but realizing starting from the realization that any beginning is always, as I guess Deleuze and Guattari would say, a beginning in the middle, right? You're always beginning for where someone else left off, or someone else continued, or someone else was there before, or you're always in relationship to that sort of that already there. So with that in mind, what already there did you guys start with Firefly? Or, I mean, you already sort of started to hint at some of the things with there was out there with terms of Radio Alice, and then was it Radio Tomate? Was that Guattari's thing?
Radio Tomate, yes.
Yeah, Radio Tomate. Then a whole network of other radios that kind of spiraled from that. Of course, then a lot of them became commercial radios as well. I mean, for us, I think our connection to radio it kind of began seriously maybe in the early 2000s when we did a kind of experimental music and sound art program on a kind of independent squat radio in Turin. We did that for several years, and from that we started sort of also working in sort of radio art as well. We started sort of conceiving, projects for kind of radio art festivals as well. And we took that with us, the program, which is called Terminal Beach, we took that with us when we went to Paris to start making films. And we had a kind of show of Terminal Beach once a month, I think, on Radio Libertaire in Paris, in a very, very, quite a famous sort of experimental music program that had been going since the 80s, I think, called Epsilonia. And they were very gracious, and they hosted us once a month, and we did Terminal Beach there. And then we kind of let it go for a bit, because we were much more involved at that point in making films, which is very, very time consuming, and it takes a lot out of you. So we didn't really have much time for radio after that, except then one of the films that we did brought us back to Guattari. So that brought the radio connection back in our thinking, because in a way the project we did around Guattari was referencing a lot his work with free radio, although it was the thing itself was a science fiction screenplay that Guattari wrote in the 80s, but it had a kind of very, very strong radio component.
If I remember correctly, that's how I actually meet you two at Mayday Rooms at a screening of the film, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the sponsor clip you played to us reminded me also of a project we actually made before we shot the film of In Search of Week. We made a trailer for Guattari's film as if it was released in theaters. And that was in France with a kind of very mainstream radio, Arte Radio. But it was great because it was a very kind of 80s trailer where we reconstructed some of the sounds and some of the dialogues with actors and stuff. So it was, it had this kind of situationist approach to the fact that people would believe and would just buy the ticket and go to see Felix's film. And it was a lot of fun. So we did that, for example. That was very inspiring. And
there was, I think at that kind of time, there were quite a lot of trailers for films on radio, and sometimes they were quite long, and they would basically you would hear scenes from films. So we were kind of inspired by that to do the Guattari. And also with the voice of God, that was the other thing, because that was another big 80s thing, which has kind of disappeared from trailers. Trailers are now very, very kind of minimalist, mute kind of things, or the only kind of, or maybe the voice of God has been displaced from the thwom of the sound design. It's now just boom, like this, that basically announces some kind of spectacular event. But we had the guy who was playing Week also as the voice of God of the trailer. So it kind of created this kind of space where the infracourt universe character then became outside the trailer and was sort of influencing the whole marketing and production campaign as well for the film.
I've never actually seen that trailer. Is that available to see, or?
Well, it's available.
Here.
Yeah, of course, we'll send you the link. Yeah. It's in French, but for a show in London, we subtitled it, so it's sound, but then the kind of Guy Debord black screen exists with the sound and the subtitles in English. So we'll send you that version. That makes
Roman en faveur de Week.
En faveur de Félix.
And so that was it got us thinking again about radio and sound, because from the fact that with the Guattari film, after our film, we continued that project with the idea always of trying to manifest this kind of science fiction universe, kind of political science fiction universe that Guattari envisaged with this film, but in other ways. So the idea was never to make the film, but always to manifest it in other ways. And so that got us into sound work, kind of a series of sessions of envisioning the screenplay with people, and then to make a sound work of that. And I think that sort of like really started again, kind of thinking about sound, maybe slightly away from actual, sound for film, but real sound on its own. And so then that naturally took us back to the radio, because in a way radio seemed to us to be precisely this kind of it had this potential for really experimental sound making in a more improvised way, because obviously when you make a sound work, it's a very kind of precise thing that you're basically editing in a very, very kind of meticulous way. But the radio provides that possibility, but also in a slightly more, informal or improvised way. So then we started thinking, what it would be to have to create an online radio, and that was when we were still in Paris, but we didn't actually do it until we moved to Sicily in 2020.
I suppose it also came from a desire to construct some kind of common place to inhabit with people through sound, with people that were scattered around the world, and having traveled a lot, being displaced, and having a lot of friends of comrades in different geographies and cosmologies. We thought at that point that was actually the beginning of the COVID epidemics. But we would have done it anyway, so that we thought, well, it would be really great to be able to send each other messages through radio podcasts, and then to create a community, or a coming community, or a community without community, where the people who were listening were actually also makers, so that we wouldn't have the division between transmitters and receivers, but have this kind of space where we could just send stuff to each other.
But I think
it's interesting because like there's two elements here, or probably many more than two elements, but two I'm thinking of. Radio as a kind of medium of transmission to hear sound art or interviews or broadcasts. So radio as medium, and maybe radio also as this kind of, let's say, a kind of parasociality, as the common platform, and it's how these two things fit together that's actually perhaps the most interesting. And it's not just communication, but it's also communication which creates forms of belonging or identification beyond it. And I'm also thinking about like my understanding for instance for Radio Alice is that there's very few recordings of it, except for, is it the recording of like when the police actually raid the station and the collectivity is taken apart?
Yeah, it's actually the last minutes before the cops arrive, and then you hear really the
there was a CD and a book which came out, I think, about, when was it, mid-2000s or something, which had kind of extracts from Radio Alice broadcasts. So
just with the booklet, and it was the Collettivo Attraverso. And obviously Bifo was a member, but there were many other people. And no, it's great you mentioned Radio Alice, because also another thing that inspired us was the way Radio Alice was mixing dreams and things for kids, and experimental and direct militancy. And so we thought that also through radio we could have that kind of mix, where the kind of revolution of everyday life would somehow start taking place through sound.
Yeah, I think that this question of sound links a lot to life practices. I mean, in the sense that, for us, for example, COVID was an interesting incentive in the way that already people, started, Zooming a lot to each other, and there was a lot of video conferencing. And what we found with this video conferencing, which we're now doing, I mean, we're using a video conferencing technology, is that partly that kind of sense of sonic intimacy was both maybe encouraged but also frustrated because of the technology itself, the way in which you had this kind of very, very, annoying filters that were kind of basically focusing everything on the voice. So there wasn't the question of, you couldn't really perceive sonic space around people where they were in space.
And also focusing on faciality.
Yeah, and it also focused on faciality and this kind of, shot, reverse shot sort of thing of talking directly to people, like I'm doing to you now, like we're with you now. But I tend to try, I don't know, I might divert my gaze all the time.
But with editing we can cut
Yeah, with
this
editing we can cut it. And so one thing that, into this question of sound, listening on its own as a kind of form of intimacy related to the voice, but also related to space, was one thing that we were really interested in trying to think of as a base for this kind of parasocial community, but also opacity as well. That would be another one, because the idea of just having voices and voices that weren't necessarily identified. So I think a lot of our thinking about radio through the years has been kind of very counterintuitive in relation to, how radio has, developed commercially or even in terms of the state, which is we looked for disorientation before orientation, because in some way that's part of the desire and mystery of, hearing things and trying to work out what's going on. And those were some of the kind of formative radio experiences that at least I had. I don't know about Silvia, but to come across something that you weren't sure exactly what you were listening to, and to feel kind of fundamentally disorientated, but very much in touch with a kind of practice.
No, it sounds good. I mean, for instance, like with the minor composition stuff I've done, the way I've done it has always been, I think of the kind of conversation I want to have with someone, regardless of whether it like is necessarily easily approachable, and just do it that way and let things evolve as they will. And if people get on board with it, cool. If they don't, it's okay. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that when we first started like discussing this question of a relation between a partnership between minor compositions and Firefly, it was in Puglia, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we did this first kind of Becoming Fireflies meeting with Nicola and Alessandro, who are also co-founders of the radio. I think that also one thing that really appealed to us about minor compositions in general was the way in which you conceive, this question of politics in relation to all kinds of areas of everyday life practices, of hobbies, of, passions, sport, music, environment, all kinds of things that often, are separated out. So, it's not often you get a kind of Deleuzian sort of approach to football or something like that, which was very, very interesting. And for us, because it really chimed with this kind of heterogeneity that we were trying to, and multiplicity that we were trying to sort of encourage in the kind of podcasts or ideas for shows that people were bringing to Firefly. And
that's actually one thing I'd like to really flag up, because I think the sort of role that minor compositions takes in relation to Fireflies as a swarm is being slightly more outward facing, and particularly because we use what's it called, the various feed mechanisms that make it approachable via podcast mechanisms. But there are other parts of the swarm which are not. You have to sort of delve into the swarm to find them. So like the readings and the sort of mixtapes and all the other interesting things. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the various wonders or interesting things you will find inside the Firefly if you look further into it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we've always tried to think about what the various kind of podcasts that we have and the episodes even in terms of kind of constellations of resonances that pass across and between all of these different things. And that at the very beginning of the idea of the radio was that we would concentrate on actual ways of making rather than on subject areas. So, for example, one of the things that we were very, very concerned about was to not make any kind of separation a priori between talk and music or sound, to try to, in a sense, bring all of these elements together in a kind of continuum. And so, for example, one of the podcasts that we developed in relation to that was, which actually started on the basis of talks, was ambient thought, which the idea for ambient thought came from listening to philosophy talks or artist talks that you might find on YouTube or other platforms, and to think a way of how to bring back a certain liveness about these talks that, you know, if you weren't there and you're watching it on this kind of, you know, platform of archive or an archive as YouTube is sometimes perceived, you kind of felt it kind of fell a bit flat. So I think that one of the things we thought about doing was how could we somehow with this was to reimagine a talk almost like a DJ set, and to incorporate elements of sound and music that would resonate with what was being said, and then to re-edit the talk in a much more rhythmic way. Mm. So that was like one possibility, with like imagining a kind of philosophical or conceptual chill out room where you could, you know, listen to really, really great talks, but at the same time have this sonic environment that was, you know, pulling you in different directions. So that's one example. And then more maybe related to the kind of deserteur sort of everyday life practices thing. We had this program which was suggested by a friend who is actually one of our collaborators on films, a sound engineer, where he'd been recording lullabies for his kid, for his son, which were based on revolutionary songs. And so we started this program. We invited him to send us some songs, and then he basically, his contribution started this program called Lullabies for the Revolution. And then we sent out a call for other people to send lullabies that were somehow linked to political songs or that they would sing to their kids. You know.
And obviously all these series are still completely open, and so if anybody wants to send us something it's really great, they just send it and we edit it a bit if necessary, add the jingle. Yeah. But I wanted to add also, when Graeme was talking about radio and disorientation or defamiliarization, we dream of a radio that it's at the same time untimely, but also reacting very quickly to what's going on. So, for example, our own show, Terminal Beach, that is mainly music with kind of mixtapes, and we speak very, very little. And the idea there is really that you can get lost on Terminal Beach. But at the same time, we do feel the need to open series when, you know, something really
cataclysmic.
Happens. Like, for example, 2 years ago we started a series called Memory for Denial. The title is inspired by Mahmoud Darwish, and so it's basically people sending us texts, readings, and music also to support the Palestinian struggle. And for that, for example, we were helping the Gaza Biennale in Berlin, and we actually broadcast on Firefly Frequencies some of the artists from Gaza that made soundworks, and they even just recorded some texts for us, and diaries, and also we created 2 listening rooms that were kind of curated, and we prepared some programs from Firefly, and they had a really nice anti-capitalistic kitchen for a month in Berlin. And so there were all sorts of people, and before dinner they had this moment in the dark, lying down on cushions and blankets because they didn't have the money for heating, and they were just listening to different things. So this question also of creating listening rooms is very much part of the practice. And is there a podcast in particular that you have been listening to? Or now I do like Godard, I ask counter questions.
I'll get there in a second. One of the things that strikes me with the way we're talking about ambient thought that I think is quite interesting and gets to a more general point is oftentimes when we read someone, we miss out a lot of the things in the voice and in the rhythm. So I was thinking about the first time I read Henry Miller, Tropic of Cancer. I didn't get it at all. I was like, what is this? This is crap. And then I listened to a recording of him reading a Tropic of Cancer, and I was like, oh, it made so much more sense because you get the rhythm of the voice and the inflection, and it points out to what's how to read the text in a way that follows that rhythm. And the same way when people ask me, like, how do I read, Fred and Stefano? How do I, I find it hard to read other comments. I'm like, listen to them talk about it, get the rhythm of the poetry, the poetics, and then it'll make more sense to you. And so what I like about that in a more general sense is it's all those things in the voice, in the tone, in the rhythm, all those things which are not readily obvious in the text because they aren't there, are the things that you have to attend to in a radio sense because they're much more prominent, they're much more clear, they're much more. So in a way, it's almost like collective listening becomes a practice of attending to the things that get lost otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this haptic, also quality that the voice has. You feel touched by a voice. You're like. It's a very, very important component of thinking. I think we have this tendency to separate ideas from their articulation and particularly the way that they come up. We've worked for quite a long time with Deleuze, and most recently we've been working a lot with a project to put the archive of Deleuze's teachings of Vincennes and Saint-Denis online in English, with English translated into English. We've been translating Deleuze's cinema courses and trying to, in a sense, to convey this orality of Deleuze, which is such an important part of his thinking, in English as well. So listening to those, tapes, which are, it's interesting to think that Deleuze's courses were transmitted through tape recordings, whereas, say, Foucault or Lacan or Derrida, the texts were already there. They were written to be delivered in lectures. So you have this kind of, very, very fragile transmission of thought, apart from, the books are obviously there, but this is a different thing because it's actually when thoughts actually are born, when ideas are born in this kind of very, very intense pedagogical atmosphere. And then, we've tried to be the amanuensis of that, but to the amanuensis of the affect as much as the actual concepts themselves. So that the question of orality, I think, is coming back into a much more a much more subtle idea of what publishing is, even in some ways.
I personally think perhaps one of the more interesting ways to approach Firefly is not to necessarily look for things, but to almost like put it on like kind of like a random setting and see what you wander into by accident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The random is
Yeah.
exactly made for that. And but to go back to what you were saying, I mean, ambient thought is more the case of what we called also digital undercommoning, like that we find lectures online and then we remix them, we put music. But then there's the other series called voicings, where it's actually people reading text, which it can be also really great, because sometimes when you read a text that really affects you, you really need to read it aloud. You want to stop people in the street and say, hey, listen to this. This is what happened to me when I read first the Undercommons. I mean, I just needed to read it to other people or to hear it. And of course, I knew a little bit, both Fred and Stefano, so I could hear their voice, but I also wanted this act of possession where I would actually, carry the voice and share it with other people. So voicings is also a session where, people just send us readings of poetry or readings of critical texts or that have affected them, with the idea of sharing them.
Yeah, and it's a kind of, it's also this question of there's a moment when, somebody, thinks, oh, after this text I want to read. And it's the moment that counts as much as the text itself, because it's like, it brings it back to the question of what place that occupies in a life continuum. And it's not just abstracted of like saying this is a reading of this text, I think it's very important. I mean, the whole question of undercommoning, I think, is also to bring, what you could call cultural artifacts back into this very, very felt relationship that they have when people are actually reading them, or when they're, when they're struck by something, and how radio, I mean, this is obviously in some ways our ideal, but would be this question of senders, receivers, rather than listeners, transmitters, would be this kind of reciprocal relationship of people basically sending, I think, was it Alessandro who used the expression sonic gifts, sonic gifts, like letters almost, and to think about the radio in that way as this kind of porous, multi-directional sort of thing.
One text which I've considered trying to do a reading of some point is there's this short text by Fred called The Assessment, where he talks about basically thinking is a fugitive practice, and you have to escape from the conditions that you're in. And I've always hesitated because I'm just never going to sound like Fred, and Fred sounds like Fred, right? But in a way, I realize that's kind of a mistake, because of course I'm not going to sound like Fred, but I'm going to sound like what the text means to me. And it's not a question of sounding like someone else. It's a question of bringing something else to the meaning, to the what's being done, rather than trying to being another thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, it's like cover versions of songs in that sense. I mean, like, you don't try to, any cover version worth the name doesn't try to restitute what the original sound was like. It really sometimes radically changes.
Yeah, I mean, like, no one goes like, man, when Jimi Hendrix covered All Along the Watchtower, he totally failed to be Bob Dylan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that I think it's also like about what are we commoning, when we talk about like trying to construct a community online. It's very, very difficult. I mean, our models are sometimes community radios that actually exist in space, and therefore they have a space where people gather regularly, and some people are actually transmitting, but other people are conversing or hanging out or just hanging out. Yeah, exactly like that. And an online sort of radio, it's a very, very difficult thing to try to achieve that level of entanglement. Yeah, maybe entanglement of people in this way. But it's something that we kind of work towards, and particularly like if we have gatherings, if we have listening rooms, then we can get people involved in that more. and also this question of trying to think of things that anybody could actually do, to make a program. Like Mixed Feelings is like a mixtape program, and mixtapes are such, on the one hand, a very personal thing, but they're also a historical thing. They can be a political thing. They involve acts of montage. Coming from cinema, we've really brought that kind of thinking about montage into what we do on radio, and it's a very, very important aspect of how we conceive it, both montage within programs and also the montage, how to put things together in different programs or episodes that somehow link to each other across different series.
One model I particularly like, I don't know how much you've listened to them, but is our friends over at Acid Horizon, which is interesting because they also started in around 2020, so around the same time, and are also coming from a very Deleuzian place. And one of the things that they do is, in addition to making podcasts, they also run reading groups. And so occasionally they'll do podcast episodes where it'll be like talking to two people from a reading group who will talk about, sort of trying to summarize what they discussed in a reading group. And the reading groups are not like the episodes. They're like take place in a different context. But it's that sort of like back and forth between the sort of entanglement of a discussion, which then gets into something else, then goes back into another thing. Speaking of which, moment of blatant self-promotion. If you're listening to this now, on February 2nd, we're starting our year-long Mario Tronti reading group for the 60th anniversary of Workers in Capital. So if that sounds like a kind of thing you would be interested in, look at the Minor Compositions website, and you'll see. You can email to get the sort of links for us to sort of. We're doing a discussion once a month over from now till December. So even if you are hearing this several months later, you can still join in. And yeah, anyways, I feel really we're doing an ad for myself. That feels really. Anyways, yeah, it'll be fun if talking about. Actually, maybe fun's the wrong word. Is reading Tronti fun? Not really fun. It's need a better word.
Instructive.
Instructive, yeah. Yeah. No, but okay. So where were we going to go?
Yeah, we were talking about the question of montage and how it sort of affects the architecture of what a radio schedule or playlist or is or can be. One of the things that we've tried to do over the years since we started working with the Lumbung radio, which was a kind of collective of different radios that was formed around the time of Documenta 15 with Ruin Grupa, with the Ruin Grupa, curation of Documenta that went as it went thanks to the German press, but a lot of really, really interesting things happened at that Documenta, and one of the things was this kind of formation of a kind of network of radios all over the world that basically continued going after Kassel and is still going. So it's sort of like a way to connect to what other people are doing in different places with similar kind of radios, and sometimes bigger community radios as well.
I really want to like Lumbung Radio, and I really like the idea. And you probably already know what I'm going to say next, right? But one of the things I find it really confusing when I put on Lumbung Radio is I'll put on something and I won't know what it is or what's happening or how to find out anything more about the thing I'm hearing. And I go, oh, this is cool. What is it? How do I find out what it is?
There's the good news that we're redeveloping the website, And so the idea is that, I mean, working towards it, because we're all more or less working in kind of gift economy kind of situation. But so the new website should have information about what you're actually listening, links. And another thing that so far, I mean, there's a number of us who are broadcasting things like 3-4 times a week, but the majority of the sonic material are actually archives from Documenta, and they are even unedited, and they are kind of very difficult to like, because it's just, you're not in the situation, you're not participating. And as you said, so another thing we're reflecting collectively is how to consider archives as kind of living material to remix and do something with, rather than, this archive fever where, people just play again and again the archives. So that's another thing. So it means that probably it will not be 24/7 as a kind of schedule, but we will just have certain kind of
there'll be a kind of
specific
curated
times,
selection of things that come from that particular that experience, but then then each radio will have its own sort of page, and whatever is playing will be linked to whichever radio has produced it, and what. So there's a kind of latest podcast type of thing that will be similar to what we have, which is the latest 6 podcasts. But I mean, no, I started talking about that also because the question of remixing shows was quite sort of came up when we started working with Lumbung, because we had different sort of, it was a schedule, so we had very, very fixed slots, and particularly in the very beginning when the radios on Lumbung were kind of introducing themselves, presenting what they were doing. We sort of started doing things like completely remixing some of the podcasts that we've been doing together, even, so putting bits of one into another, or creating superpositions between things. And we found that was very, very interesting. It worked really, really well. And I kind of wonder why it's a practice that isn't used more often,
because it takes a long time to do it.
It takes a long time to do it, but it's something where you somehow, once something has been archived, it kind of becomes a kind of, as Silvia says, a kind of potential space or living material that can then be reworked. And I think that there are a lot of things that happen in music, both at the level of actual musical practices, and also maybe at the level of organization of how improvisational music works, where people come together in trios or duos or larger groups just for 2 or 3 days to do something, and then they go off and work with other people. That's something I think would be really, really nice to see in places beyond music, not just in music, but in other things. And it's something that I think that, music has a lot to teach us in terms of, let's say, help making the ways in which we get together and the things that we do when we get together evolve in a more, creative way.
What it makes you think about, and this goes back to our friends from Mayday Archives, is one of their big things is how do you activate the archives? So it's not just here's the archive, but rather what do we do that makes this meaningful in a different way to us now? So I like the idea of sort of remixing other people's stuff, because it's almost like not just taking something and playing it again, but it's actually reworking it into a different configuration of meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would be really great if we could give archives to people that are working in completely different fields, and to see how they would react. Otherwise, there's also this very kind of incestuous thing, for example, in the art world, where it's artists that would remix artists, whereas it would be really great to, just also as a pedagogical approach, with students, or to just give them some archives and see what they recreate with bits and pieces.
Well, what I want to hear is like, okay, first we take like Joseph Boyce at Documenta, dub reggae remix.
Yeah, why not? I mean, this is I think that it's also to have a much more active relationship with, things that one has had maybe had a tendency to consume, not, I mean, not passively, but I mean, in a way in which the thing remains what it is, and the thing remains basically that, and then it maybe repeats, and it's available. But this, very availability of so much stuff,
Actually, I was now looking to be sure, but it would be cool to do a Mario Tronti remix, because when we were trying to define him, for me, he's really like serious and kind of old school. So maybe we don't promise anything, Stephen, but maybe we can come up with some kind
with
of
an
ambient thought with
Mario.
Tronti that would be really cool also for your group.
How about third wave ska Tronti? So it's like pick it up, that class antagonism.
Wow.
Okay, maybe not. That's taking too, yeah. But no, what I quite like about this like, sort of notion of radio production is, in my mind, and this is part of why I wanted to start making podcasts for modern compositions, is thinking of it not as separate to publishing, but as just part of publishing, where it's all part of an extended conversation and extended thinking, which happens through weird sounds, mixtapes, conversations. Occasionally, these blocks called books show up, but they're like waypoints in a journey rather than being the end point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear now that, I mean, if we're reading sometimes on like tablets, like you're reading a book and then you get references to something that sends you to, a kind of YouTube video or something we're already in this kind of mode of reading, that is expanding towards other things, and that can include conversations. It's a kind of, a sense of drift mode. I mean, without obviously completely losing the thread, because obviously you want to keep the thread, but the threads become much more entangled because of that.
You read a novel, it mentions a song, then you would go to look for the song, and so
or a piece of music or a film, or and so that kind of multimodal reading is really something which, despite its many, the many problems with it, the digital world has gifted us. So we really are kind of expanding that possibility, and to incorporate that into actually thinking about what publishing is or can be, I think is a very, very important, thing to reevaluate. And we were really struck by this, for example, when we were in Dakar 2 years ago at the African Art Book Fair, and even prior to that in Berlin at another book fair, Misread, was this sense in which, for example, radio could be a very, very important link for publishers who couldn't simply travel, they couldn't get their books, distributed in Europe. We're talking about here a lot of African publishers who have great, great difficulty getting books, distributed in Europe, and how the kind of, critical thinking that goes on in those books could also find a platform in radio and conversations. So, it's you have to think about it as extended publishing.
Interesting. I'm trying to think of like what would be sort of like the publishing equivalent of like, say, Naegi, who I think as a sort of record label has actually found a much more sort of, let's say, resonance and circulation outside of, they're from Uganda, right?
Uganda, yeah, you're right.
Uganda,
yeah.
Kampala, Uganda.
Yeah.
I mean, or for example, when you like published on minor compositions the lyrics of Senyawa, I mean, that's a very, very interesting thing, because it links obviously to the music, but it's like part of your montage of what you're doing with also the other.
I mean, Sinyal were interesting also because I'm thinking about the album they did where they sort of had an open call for people who wanted to work with them to put out the record, and then they ended up putting out with I think 44 different labels in different countries. So there's like 44 different versions of the album Alkisa, all of which have different covers and are slightly different than every other version.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's sort of enabling a kind of I'm going to say collectivity, but it's more like a kind of like a seriality, a form of collectivity. You know, it's not like everyone is together in the same. But it's almost more like they're connected to create it, to do interesting things, but they aren't so sort of like all in the same place. They're all sort of like dispersed and developing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's now been, I think, a kind of revival also. I mean, within music production, I mean, like when we do Terminal Beach, like we did a roundup of 2025 fairly recently. And one of the things that we were kind of focusing on in that was a number of, spoken word music records with a lot of poetry, a lot of spoken word or short narrative. So there's, I think, a kind of move also towards that in music, more and more spoken word in music. So you're already getting this kind of sense of a kind of multimodal listening when you're listening to a record, because there's a lot of
Well, a great example is More Mother.
Yeah, well, I mean
Yeah.
that's an example, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of other ones
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
I was just thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's something which is going to get stronger and stronger,
Yeah.
in the next
Yeah,
few
and
years.
another thing that we would like to do and we haven't done yet with Firefly, that is connected to publishing, to try kind of tentative spoken translations of books that don't actually get translated into English, because we thought that if we did that, I mean, where, for example, a book, each person would do an oral translation of a chapter, it would be quite interesting, because unlike printed translations, it would retain the element of thinking that you're translating and you're thinking and you're trying to find something and maybe you fail and then you rephrase. So I think translation also has a great potential for radio. We did it once for a friend, a Brazilian philosopher who was also a student of Deleuze from the 70s. So he needed a French translation of his, what was it, from English to French? And when we were in the collective Presque Ruine, so we put online actually oral translation, so you could hear the street, you could hear, the room tone, so I think that doing this kind of radio translations, and maybe we can imagine something together, Stephen, and would be really cool.
Well, I'm thinking about More Mother, and then thinking about not just her by herself as a solo artist, but also her working with irreversible entanglements.
Yeah.
But then also like her thinking with her partner Rashida Phillips, working on sort of Afrofuturism and poetry, and how all these things fit together. So like if you like read Rashida's book, and then read it thinking about her relationship with it all fits together in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't really a kind of clear separation between those elements. You sort of like, they just, you just move from one to the other. And it's, again, this returns to this question of a much more organic rapport with the kind of life continuum, whereby you're, moving between reading something, listening to something, thinking about how you could remix something, how you could, those things. I think the independent online radio is one of the places where those kind of things could find a platform. I mean, I was thinking about just the ways in which we listen to music. I mean, as an example, like sometimes, for example, we'll be here and we're like listening to things because maybe we're preparing a Terminal Beach program and listening like with the window open and just with the computer speakers, I hear the music in a completely different way because I'm hearing all the environment. So I think, why shouldn't we do a show like that? Of like listening to things in the environment where you're listening, with all of the interruptions and interferences that that environment actually, provides, and how those interact with the music, because that is in a sense about how listening takes place. Listening takes place always in a kind of space, not always in a headphone space. It's often in a space where other things are happening. And
Yeah. I want to do a mixtape, but a mixtape done at a diner around 3 or 4 a.m., which is the time in which the out late crowd who are coming, who come from the club meets the going to work early crowd,
Yeah.
yeah,
and you get this weird clash of temporalities and expectations.
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Or you could do something about playing music on your record how you play music on your phone in a public space, or and make that the kind of subject of what the program is, and rather than just because music programs are very, very focused on kind of a particular mode of presenting and listening to music. That is, I mean, I don't know if it's promotional. I mean, it's certainly something which, in a sense, gives people the idea that I'm listening to this. Maybe I want to buy the record or something like that. But because I'm hearing it more or less as I would hear it if I had it. But there are other ways in which radio doesn't it can digress from that particular modality of presentation. Can do a lot of other things, and that's kind of the spaces that we want to try and open up. Or film sound, that was another thing that we had an idea for a podcast about film sound, and how listening to film sound without the actual film, the actual images, can be a very interesting experience. So seeing voices. Seeing voices. Yeah. So yeah, there are a lot of great possibilities.
Field recordings. We've got nature falls.
Yeah, I mean, field recordings are such a simple thing when you think about it. Like anybody who has a phone can just record their environment, and I think that's the thing. When we call out for people to contribute, we wanted to also to make it very, very easy to do that, and not.
Ooh, I do have a field recording for you. So when I was in Morocco with my son, we spent 2 days in Rabat because I'm super interested in the history of 17th century piracy in Rabat, and so the recording is standing near like the edge, like the sea, in a cemetery, but hearing Friday call for prayers.
Ah, wow.
Wow.
Yeah. No, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, send it. We'll put it on.
Cool. Well, I should probably nudge us to not a conclusion, but a pause in proceeding. So maybe as a way to sort of do that, if people listening have been sufficiently intrigued by the various things that happen in Firefly, again, this is not a recruiting drive. You do not get to join the party or get a secret decoder ring, although I really want a secret decoder ring. If people are sufficiently interested that they want to say, hey, I've got a mixtape or a field recording or a thing I want to do, what should they do? Should they like put an envelope underneath the sink at a certain cafe, or?
Yeah, well, that's a very nice, image. Yeah, I guess with this question of the clandestinity of it, we were talking about opacity earlier on, and how that is actually part of, in some way, the excitement of doing things in this kind of not super visible way. Also because radio isn't supposed to be visible in some ways, but yeah, we can. On the radio website, there's our email, and people can send stuff. We transfer, drop off. So just drop us a line with an idea that they might have, and it's very, very quick, the process. we even do, post-production on things, if they need a little bit of tweaking, sometimes recordings can, be brought up a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I would say that the best thing to do is to visit the website and drop us a line.
Cool. Sounds good. Yeah, and then hopefully at some point in the future we'll have an excuse to have another actually gathering in person, whether it's in South Italy or somewhere else.
Yeah, that would be really great.
Yeah.
I think we have to do
Yeah,
that.
we should do another gathering. The last one was very, very nice, but it was now 4 years ago. So yeah, yeah. I mean, now we've moved. We were in Palermo before, and now we've moved to the countryside, to a forest in the north of Italy, and one of the ideas that we have here is to do some things here, and that might well involve the radio as one of the components of what we do here as well. So we may be announcing gatherings in the future.
Yeah. And we also accept ideas for new series. That happened, for example, with Mario, who is a Spanish DJ working for Radio Al Jara and the Palestinian radio. And he just wrote to us and he said, I want to start a series called Seeds, and started sending us stuff. And so we opened an entire new series for it's mainly mixtape.
Yeah, it's like a mixtape type of series.
So also new ideas. Our dream was also to have recipes and people teaching their favorite recipes. So we want to continue that, and we invite everybody to send us recipes. For the moment, we have very few, but the idea was actually to narrate a recipe, but also so that somebody who listens could actually start cooking it, but with this, affective way of talking also about what the recipe means, etc., etc. So yeah, we are very open to all contributions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for both of you for coming along, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.